Afternoon. Welcome to the Arctic Research Consortium of the United States, ARCUS, where Arctic research has connected since 1988. My name is Bob Rich. I'm the Executive Director. And thank you so much for coming to our 22nd Arctic Research Seminar Series presentation in Washington, D.C., where we're delighted today to welcome Hong Nong. ARCUS connects Arctic research across boundaries through communication, coordination, and collaboration, providing the essential and tangible infrastructure required for research to advance. We're a not-for-profit consortium working together to promote exploration and understanding of the Arctic. Whether you're here in Washington, D.C. or online, we invite each of you to become an ARCUS member. All types of organizations are eligible to become ARCUS members, including academic institutions, government agencies, corporations and indigenous organizations, nonprofits, and others. Also, any individual who shares our enthusiasm about the importance of Arctic research is certainly welcome to become an individual ARCUS member. I invite each of you to join us. You can find out more and join online at www.arcus.org. This seminar series is designed to provide unique access to a wide range of leading Arctic researchers and leaders for federal officials, members of the DC policy community, and the broader public interested in the changing Arctic. The ideas shared here represent the cutting edge of what we're learning and exploring up north, and also what it means for the United States and the rest of the world. If you're in the room, you should have received a seminar evaluation, which we'd like you to return to the registration desk at the conclusion. We're currently planning upcoming seminars and need your suggestions to select the best possible speakers. For those of you online, shortly at the end of the seminar, there will be a quick poll that comes up on your screen. Encourage you to fill that out so that we can get your feedback as well. For those of you on Twitter, we encourage you to use the hashtag ArcusWebinar, you can see it on the screen here, to discuss the event. So today we're joined by more than 110 registered participants in at least 10 U.S. states and in Canada, Finland, Iceland, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom, as well as the 15 or so we have here in Washington, D.C. For those of you on the webinar, my colleagues are available to answer any questions you have about ARCUS or Arctic research and to forward to us here in D.C. any questions for Dr. Hong. You'll have the opportunity to submit text questions at any time by typing your questions into the chat panel. You may send your questions during the presentation. We'll collect them and address them during the Q&A session at the end. I'd like to acknowledge our partners in this seminar series, the Consortium for Ocean Leadership, which enables us to use this fantastic meeting space, and the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine's Polar Research Board for help with registration. Of course, I need to thank and very much like to thank the National Science Foundation's Division of Polar Programs for major financial support to ARCUS and this seminar series that makes everything possible. Now, let me introduce our speaker. I'll briefly summarize her many accomplishments, and a full bio is online. Dr. Hong Nong is Executive Director and Senior Fellow of the Institute for China-America Studies. Dr. Hong holds a PhD from the University of Alberta in Canada, where she was also a postdoc in the China Institute. She's held visiting fellowships at the University of Virginia and at the Max Planck Institute for Comparative Public Law and International Law. She's currently also a research fellow with the National Institute for South China Sea Studies in China and the China Institute at the University of Alberta in Canada. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to the ARCUS DC Arctic Research Seminar Series, Dr. Hong Nong, to tell us about the implications of China's Arctic Policy White Paper.
Thank you, Dr. Rich, for a very kind introduction, and thank you to Arctic Research Consortium of the United States for organizing this event and giving me this chance to explain what's my finding on Chinese Arctic Policy White Paper and share with you my very preliminary study on Chinese interest in the Arctic. And thank you to you all for coming. So I think, well, it's very well known that currently the geopolitical landscape of the Arctic has is a significant departure from the great power politics competition that existed in this region and during the Cold War. So in addition to those traditional Arctic littoral states or Arctic circumpolar states, more and more international organizations and non-Arctic countries are showing increasing interest in Arctic, and China is one of them. So today I would like to share with you what are Chinese interests by explaining Chinese Arctic white paper policy, Arctic policy white paper. So in 2013, together with Japan, South Korea, Singapore, and India, and China actually was granted the observer status in the Arctic Council. So Japan and South Korea are very quick to publish their policy or Arctic strategy, and China has been waiting for almost 3 years or 4 years. Finally, in January 26, and then it issued its Arctic policy, and which you can see I will only highlight those headlines and which you might read in details online, and I hopefully through this presentation I'd like to share with you in the general framework of this policy and trying to explain what are China's interest in Arctic. So actually after January 26th, and there are many international media coverage about China's interest in Arctic, and they vary very much. For instance, like Chinese and media actually are all emphasize China's interest more on environmental and also research and also access to international shipping in this region. And there is also a highlighting about China is hoping to build out the polar maritime Silk Road in the Arctic. And that's very pro-China uh, media coverage. And certainly we also have media coverage from like Arctic states like Canada. They're more concerned about what is China's intention or strategic intention in the Arctic. And I also did a little research to compare all those like how Russia, how United States, and then Norway, other countries look at Chinese Arctic policy white paper. So just to share with you the so I did a little report on explaining China's Arctic policy. So my report actually tried to explain from the following categories to explain China's policy. First one is to seek participation in the Arctic Council, and the second is promote bilateral diplomacy in the Arctic area. And in addition to that, and China also has interest in shipping through the Arctic, and also has interest in exploring the possibility of joint development or joint ventures in the resource development in the Arctic. And certainly in China, you can see from the Arctic white paper, and China's emphasized substantially its interest in the research in the Arctic, especially on climate change. And also there's something that has been repeatedly emphasized in the Arctic paper is China is hoping to cooperate between, trying to promote a cooperation between the Arctic states and non-Arctic states. So let me start with this one. I apologize, I can't read very carefully. This Chinese policy actually, can be emphasized in 4 keywords to understand, to respect, to develop, and participate. In order to achieve these goals, and there's certainly some principles which emphasize in the white paper, to respect, to cooperate, and also win-win, and to emphasize sustainability. So let me start with what China's interest in participating in the Arctic Council. It took China almost from 2008 until 2013 to get the status observers. So why China's interest in joining the Arctic Council, as you can see from the Arctic policy wiper, is hoping to participate in the governance of Arctic in order to achieve this. And China will participate in hoping to participate in multilateral mechanisms. So the Arctic Council is one of the venues actually helping China to voice its concern or its interest in the Arctic. Although it will not have any vote, but it actually will provide very good venue for China to share with other stakeholders what are its interests. So, and because in order to be granted the status as observer, China has to accept the new criteria, meaning it has to recognize preeminent role and responsibility of the Arctic littoral states or circumpolar states, and also have to recognize the sovereignty and sovereign claims of those states. So that is why in the white paper, China emphasized very clearly that it had becoming observer and it will strictly stick to the new criteria. So you can also see on the Arctic Council website, there's a documentary at which you can find the annual report from all these observers. So the most recent one is the 2016 annual review, from which you will see that China has been very actively participating in these expert working group meeting and also other like subcategory meeting under the Arctic Council. Thank you. And I also want to share with you, China's been promoting very much the bilateral diplomacy in the Arctic. So it's very interesting to know that on the one hand, China is developing contacts with sort of small Arctic power like Iceland, Norway, and Denmark. And through, for instance, conducting cooperation on the research and also policy on the shipping, etc. So one of the examples is that together with 6 research institutes from the Nordic countries, and the China Nordic Arctic Research Center was established in Shanghai. That's one example to show you that China has been conducting or working very closely with countries, Northern European countries. So in terms of the relationship with comparatively bigger power like Russia, like US, and like Canada, China is more focused on bilateral issues, on general bilateral issues, rather than focusing purely on the Arctic issues. That's a little bit different if you want to compare China's bilateral relationship with all those circumpolar states. So in addition to working with Arctic states, and China is also working very closely with other non-Arctic states like South Korea and Japan, who became the permanent observer of the Arctic Council together with China in the same year in 2013. So the first meeting, very similar trilateral meeting, was conducted in South Korea. So, and as I mentioned, shipping in the Arctic is very important to countries like China and Japan and South Korea because their economic dependent very much on international shipping and maritime infrastructure. So I'm pretty sure everyone sitting in this room or watching this video from webinar very aware about this economic benefit if the future, even some that already become a reality, Northwest Passage and the Northern Sea Route, they economically will benefit a lot from countries who economically depending on international shipping volumes. So China's economy, as I mentioned, depends very much on international seaborne and maritime infrastructure. You can see from this, I try to bring to you a few slides and tables to show you how important that China's economy will depend on maritime infrastructure. You can see from this one, I'm not quite sure you can see from it, but I actually try my best to highlight those cities which are included in the top 20 container terminals. For instance, like Shanghai, Shenzhen, Ningbo, Qingdao, Guangzhou. Most of the cities actually highlighted in red are actually included in the top 20 container terminals. And this slide also shows you the top global terminals, and you can see that Tianjin, Ningbo, Qingdao, Xiamen, they are all very big ports in terms which are very important for international shipping and also very important for China's maritime infrastructure. And this one also shows you the leading ports. Let me go very quickly because they are just some figures to show how important that the future trans-Arctic shipping will be significant to China's maritime infrastructure and maritime industries. So there are many opportunities for China's maritime industry. Let me just try to present to you a few. Uh, for instance, because of the piracy, the insurance and costs from shipping traveling via the Gulf Aden and toward the Suez Canal increased tremendously. So the alternative shipping trans-Arctic routes will certainly serve lowering the risk of sailing through the piracy affecting regions. And also because there are, in addition to the interest consists of very strong polar research capacities, and China's dependence on exports and great increased shipbuilding capacity will naturally lead to examine closely the process of great exploitation of the Northern Sea route and the commercial possibility along the length. So there are a lot of opportunities for Chinese maritime transport industry in the future. In addition to that, and they will also motivate China to develop its ice technology, which it has been developed, but it's not actually as advanced as those like Arctic countries like Norway. So it like the future trans-Arctic uh, transportation actually provide motivation for China to develop its ice breaking technology as well. And looking into like economic, in addition to the economic interest, there are also environmental and economic benefit. For instance, by using fewer but larger vessels over a shortened geographical distance, and so with the container ship, which China is a major world operator, the ocean freight costs could be greatly reduced, and the vessel will not have to enter the west coast of North American ports and pay the canal fees, which can be substantial. So, as I mentioned, there are many opportunities for countries like China, Japan, and South Korea, but there is also, we cannot ignore the equal opportunities for countries in the Arctic. For instance, when the future, this is like a small news that was presented on the Arctic today. It's a website promoting Arctic study. And there was a very small example. For instance, when the future trans-Arctic shipping becomes reality, you can actually see that on the one hand, and countries like Norway, they will be able, like countries like Japan, China will be able to pick up goods from the North European countries, and the North European country also will be loaded Asian goods and to Finland and then through tunnels to the Estonia and then to the middle of Europe. So the benefit, economic benefit, it's equally, I think, important for non-Arctic states and also Arctic states. So talking about opportunities are there, but we cannot also underestimate the potential challenges of Arctic shipping. I would like to lead the political challenge and legal challenge in my following slides, why only because those are, I think, worth discussion more about it. So in terms of the safety challenges, for instance, very good example, like for instance, once I was talking to our Canadian Coast Guard friends, they're mentioning because people are interested in transporting through the Arctic, and even the cruise ships are very people are interested in doing like cruise ship tourism in the Arctic, but they tend to forget actually those many of the Arctic states they might not be ready for search and rescue, and they might not ready, for instance, install a lot of monitoring system to make sure the safety and navigation in Arctic is will be achieved. So there is some risk in terms of safety in the Arctic due to harsh weather, due to the lack of facility and also capacity building in terms of search and rescue in this region. So those are only one of the examples when we're talking about the safety challenges in the future trans-Arctic shipping. And certainly there will be environmental challenge as well. As I mentioned, the opportunity for environmental issue if you're using like larger and vessels, but it also we might face like the threats to the fragile environment in the Arctic as well. So there is always like two sides of the coins. The environment issue could be opportunity, it could be also like a challenge as well. So what I want to focus more on political challenge and legal challenge, I think it's very well understood in this group because we're talking about most of the time we're talking about the Northwest Passage which Canada is a littoral state, and also Northern Sea, where Russia is a coastal state. But there are also many like international straits in this region, but I will only focus on these two straits because those are the two areas that United States has been in a very different position with Canada and Russia. And the approach when United States working or talking or negotiating with Canada, the approach is kind of different than its approach with the Russian. So let me be more specific. I think the the transition or navigation in Northwest Passage, at least in the 20th century, is less controversial due to lack of interest in navigating this region because of the harsh weather. But in 1969, I think the Manhattan Transit actually changed a lot of the debate. So we can see that in 1960, the Manhattan voyage through the Northwest Passage, although the Canadian officers are invited to join this voyage, but also that raised a lot of debate between United States and Canada. So Canada view that the United States as ignoring Canadian sovereignty by this voyage through Canadian water because it considered Northwest Passage as the internal water, while the United States considered as international water for straits for users. So, as a counter argument, the U.S. considered that the transit by the icebreaker Polar Sea will be an exercise of freedom navigation and navigation rights that does not require prior permission or prior notification. So there is a back and forth between U.S. and Canada, but they sort of try to solve this problem by like a non-spoken policy. For instance, the 1980 agreement on the Arctic cooperation, and they're talking about cooperation, but there are two articles that was noting. The first one in Article 3 provides that the government of the United States pledged that all the navigation by U.S. icebreakers within waters claimed by Canada to be internal will be undertaken with the consent of the government of Canada, which means that every time when U.S. icebreaker will navigate through the Northwest Passage, they will require the notification or permission from the Canada. But in Article 4, and also try to make it clear that nothing in this agreement of cooperation will endanger or jeopardize the U.S. position of freedom navigation. So it's kind of a compromise between Canada and U.S. how to resolve this difference. And there is another one is like the Northern Canada traffic regulation is something also worth a lot of debate between Canada and US and also in IMO. So it's interesting to look at the following for how US and Canada are managing very well how to solve the problem. For instance, in the Obama administration in 2013, there is a nuclear strategy for the Arctic region, which focused attention on advancing U.S. security interests in the Arctic and emphasizing a lot of freedom navigation, and followed by a 2016 implementation framework for another strategy for the Arctic region. So, and then this 2013 strategy and 2016 implementation framework were both inherited by the Trump administration. That will remain as the current U.S. policy. If I'm not mistaken, you're welcome to challenge me if my understanding about the current U.S. Arctic policy is not as I observe here. And then there is in this 2016 implementation framework, I listed a couple articles here, and which U.S. emphasized quite substantially on the need and importance of freedom navigation. That will be very coherent to U.S. front up in a global scale, not only the Arctic. So that is about between U.S. and Canada. And U.S. and Russia in the Northern Sea route, it's very interesting to see to observe as well, because like in the 2012 July, there is a Russian federal law mentioning that the Northern Sea route is a historical developed national transport communication of the Russian Federation. So very clear, make it very clear that Russia considered as internal water. It would take very already, passed a lot of national legislation in terms of regulation in the Northern Sea route. So earlier on April 12th this year, and Admiral Paul Chukrum, the commander of U.S. Coast Guard, he made a statement. Currently, there is no pressure to conduct exercise for free navigation in the Arctic, but the U.S. approach is that Northern Sea route should be open as an international water corridor for a transit passage, as we see the areas being clear of ice. So in the future, we might see the United States might also consider whether it's going to take a more active, provocative position, asking these two countries to clarify the legal standards. So back to the China's Arctic policy white paper, China did not mention at all on their Northwest Sea route, Northwest Passage and Northern Sea route. It's very interesting because I think China is a very interesting position, and it doesn't want to make very clear whether it's going to endorse Canada and Russia or it's going to endorse US and the European Union, for instance, on this legal state of Northwest Passage and Northern Sea route. But it actually make it very clear that in the future on shipping in the Arctic, and everyone has to abide by the LOVS Convention, all those regulation on the LOVS Convention, also IMO Polar Code. So it's interesting to know the fact that sometimes countries, they want to keep an ambiguous position in order to maintain and to maximize interest. So, okay, I'm done with the part on shipping. Let me move on to resource development. I think I have a discussion with the lady over there about he's reading the China's entry. China is not shy from viewing or sharing its interest in resource development. And certainly it has interest there, like Japan, like South Korea. They have all interest in the resource there. But the thing is that where are the areas that those non-Arctic countries can actually participate in exploration? So basically, we're talking about two areas. The one area, because in the 2008 Elias Declaration make it clear that the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea will be the governing legal regime for the ocean governance in the Arctic region. So basically, when we're talking about the resource development, we have to make sure which area will fall within the national jurisdiction and which area will be considered as the area where everyone will fall into the jurisdiction of the International Seabed Authority. So in the Arctic, all these artists like Russia, the leader state, Russia, Norway, Denmark, Canada, and they all already submitted to this United Nations Commission on the outer limits of continental shelf, meaning that you provide your data to this commission, and they will provide you advice where are the limits of your national jurisdiction in terms of continental shelf. The U.S. hasn't done that because not hasn't ratified LOVS convention. So the question keep bothering myself is I was asking if U.S. certainly U.S. looking also at external continental shelf, but through what channel the U.S. can do so. Is it possible for the United States to also submit it to this committee? I'm not quite sure. So right now, because the process in this commission, it's a long process, and we are talking about years and years because all these countries are in the waiting list. I think so far only Russia already received recommendation and Norway as well. But Canada only submitted application in 2013, but that's not in Arctic. So we have to wait years to define where other areas are within those littoral state jurisdiction, and then where other areas will be considered as the area, which means that for non-Arctic states like China, they have to, in order to be involved in the resource development, they right now they can only cooperate with the Arctic state, like through cooperation with Russia, with Canada, with Norway, for instance. Because for the area and the International Seabed Authority will have the jurisdiction, but we don't know yet where are those clear cut. So we're talking about resource. We're talking about, for instance, the 30% of the world's undiscovered gas and 30% of the undiscovered oil, and from 3 to 25 of the world's hydrocarbon resources, and also the metals and minerals. But most of them, as you can see, that in the Eurasia side is more on natural gas, but North America is more on like oil deposit. So, and with whom, as I mentioned, in order to be involved in Arctic resource development, you have to work with those Arctic states. So, my report actually focused on like country by different case, like for instance, the countries between Russia and China, Canada, China, Norway, China, England. So I'm not going to go over all these like case studies, just to share a couple observations when China is being engaged in the cooperation on resource development. And we can compare those countries' attitude, how they view the Chinese cooperation. For instance, let's take Canada as one example. So Canada, on the one hand, they are also looking in Chinese investment, but they're also very skeptical and concerned among compared with other states, Canada is more concerned or skeptical about China's intention in this region. If I may quote, for instance, there are two a slightly different school of thought in Canada, how they view China's engagement. For the first one, like in Calgary School, and like Professor David White, he's a historian, and then also Rob Hilbert, who's a political science professor. And they actually suggest the Canadians should be wary of East Asia, not only China, including Japan and South Korea as well, more aware of East Asia states as revisionism actors with interests counter those of Canada. So they consider that the involvement of those non-Arctic states might actually pose a threat to Canadian national interests. However, if you look at, for instance, there's other school of thought in Laval University in Montreal that suggest that Canada's national interests in Arctic are generally compatible with those of East Asian countries and see opportunities for cooperation instead of competition. This is a Canadian case. And then Russia, and Russia is more interesting. You see like back and forth. So their attitude towards China actually developed parallels in U.S. in China-Russia bilateral negotiation. And if we look at the year from 2008 to 2013, when Russia used to vote no to China in terms of its observer status, and then gradually, I think China and Russia is actually having more cooperation lately. And that is why we see, it's waving, the policy is waving. It's a combination of more of supportive and also ambiguity as well. But I think the most recent examples in last year in 2017, Putin emphasized Russia will encourage China's participation in the energy project and to reassure Beijing they will benefit from the cooperation. So especially, I think U.S. national strategy report and U.S. national defense strategy actually pick Russia and China as two rival states, competitive states in the future. We might see more cooperation between China and Russia in the resource development area. So Norway, I see Norway is more welcoming China investment or cooperation in this region. And Iceland, I think the Iceland attitude is more supportive, but it's also concerned because they don't want too much China investment and financial component in the country, which they are worried about with more China's investment or financial input in this region. They don't want the China influence quite a lot. So Iceland, I see like a support with skepticism as well. And Denmark, I think it welcomed China's investment. It's more like very supportive, engaging China in a resource development. But there's issue between Greenland and Denmark. It's a domestic issue that the Greenland government has always to concern because Beijing, I think, is also talking to Greenland, talking about like investing in Greenland as well. So there's something like domestic factors that will affect how it view like the countries like China's engagement in the resource development there. So we talk about where are the areas for potential cooperation. We talk about those cases between China and other countries. I would like to also to share with you there are certainly some challenges in energy development. For instance, challenges. As we mentioned, there's an unresolved boundary in the Arctic, and certainly when a foreign country wants to invest in a country, and they have to make sure those areas are not involved in any disputes in that regions. And so, and also if you look at like China's interest, Japan's interest, South Korea's interest, some of the interests are very similar, but some are also in a competitive, on a competitive agenda as well. Then we have to also look at how to consolidate those non-Arctic states' interests in these regions. And also, we cannot underscore the economic challenge as well because we don't know how much money we're talking about in order to consider the harsh weather and the limited transportation access at this moment, and also the long supply line and also physical environment. We don't know how much money that we're talking about in terms of engaging the oil exploration and then exploitation. And the timing of expansion in the Arctic production is also difficult to predict. So it's always would be very prudent to do the cost and benefit analysis in order to evaluate economic interests and economic challenges. And certainly there are technological challenges like the cost of extracting oil and gas depends on the state of available and technology and development. So I think in Chinese white paper, you can read it from there. It actually mentioned that in order to be engaged in the in the in the oil and gas development, you have to make sure the law, the international law, and also respect the domestic law, domestic regulation for those countries. But it's certainly looking at the future benefit as well. So although we're talking a lot about China's interest in the shipping and then the energy development, I think it's in the white paper it spent a lot of portion on explaining why Chinese interest in the research and what China has been done so far in terms of research cooperation in this region. So okay, sorry, I forgot about this one. I would like to explain a little bit about why sometimes potential economic return will drive interest to settle outstanding disputes. For instance, we see the example of Norway and Iceland in a dairy field. They have a very good development proposal and that put into very good implementation. I think that's something could give a very good example. Sometimes when we have this more economic incentive, it might serve as a motivation to solve the outstanding disputes. So China's role in the oil and gas development, it's in a position to input a lot of financial money there. And its strategy of scientific diplomacy so far has been proved fairly successful. But China is also acquiring a technology essential to developing new economic opportunity in the Arctic. And as I mentioned, in addition to research and shipping, and China's interest in polar research is also very huge. And that's what the China's Arctic policy wiper try to emphasize. You can see that there are three very important research institutions in Shanghai and Beijing focused substantially on the Arctic and Antarctica research. And you can see these many stations, and for instance, Great Wall Station in Antarctica, and the Zhongshan Station in Antarctica, and also the Yellow River Station in Arctic as well. And so far, the Chinese Arctic expedition, they have already conducted 8 expeditions in the Arctic. So in the research, in the white paper, it emphasized quite a lot that its interests were trying to look at the sustainable development and also environmental concern. And I would like to sort of like wrap up the presentation by talking a little about the challenge and facing China. For instance, we talk about the dispute over territorial sovereignty. Although China, like when it was accepted as the observer of the Arctic Council and recognized the sovereignty and sovereign claims of those Arctic states, but within those states, there are still there. And for countries who want to be engaged in the Arctic governance, they have to also look at respect and looking very carefully what's going on among the Arctic states. And there's also the veterans among the Arctic states, how they look at Chinese interest in the Arctic. I think that white paper, it's very interesting. I look at one report written by Wilson Center. They try to inviting people from the US, from different government, different agencies to try to understand. So it's very glad to see they are looking at the China's Arctic policy white paper in a more, I mean, they're more supportive. They're talking about transparency, for instance, China talking about itself as a strategy stakeholder instead of a near Arctic state, which is more sounds more ambiguous if you're talking yourself as a near Arctic state. But in this white paper, China actually categorize itself as a stakeholder and talking a lot about environmental concern, talking a lot about how to protect and respect indigenous people. I think those language using this Arctic policy white paper show example that China is trying to do its narration on the Arctic using the Western discourse, and they make this policy more acceptable among the Arctic countries. So the Arctic policy white paper also spent a lot of the discussion on promoting the cooperation between the Arctic and non-Arctic states and how to do that. I'm not going to elaborate on this, but I think there's a couple principles that emphasized in this paper. For instance, recognizing and respecting each other's rights and recognizing each other's legitimate interests for either you are Arctic state or you are non-Arctic states, and to promote a mutual understanding and trust will provide a basis for cooperation, and also to address trans-regional issues through joint research endeavors. I think that's what has been emphasized quite a lot in China's annual review report as observer in Arctic Council website. And to wrap up, I think it talked a lot about the peace and stability and sustainability development in the Arctic would benefit for the whole regions. So I think with that, I would like to end my presentation and thank you for your attention. I look forward to discussion.
So we have time for questions and discussion. We can take questions in the room if you raise your hand, or we have a number of questions online, and maybe I'll start with one of those. So the first set of questions that we have here has to do with China's role as an observer at the Arctic Council. And I think some of the more salient points that you might want to address are, is China satisfied with its observer role at the Arctic Council? Or has China found participation in the Arctic Council worthwhile and rewarding or frustrating?
That's a very good question. I think among the Chinese academic, and even before this Arctic policy white paper has been issued, there's a lot of debate because China spent like 7 years and to get the status as observer. So on the one hand, they see a lot of benefit for non-Arctic state because if you don't show up, you don't know what it's talking about in the Arctic Council, and if you want to be involved in ocean governance, and although you don't have any voting rights, but at least you will be there to share your concern and views. But on the other hand, it's always, for instance, like there is a group of people working in China Ocean University. They're looking more from a strategic and political strategic angle. They're looking, for instance, China, in order to become observer, you have to accept the obligation that put forward by the Arctic 5 littoral states and Arctic 8 circumpolar state, which means that you have to recognize that the preeminent role of of the governance nation has been given to those Arctic countries, and then you have expressed sovereignty and human rights. So that's a fundamental criteria that all these non-Arctic countries have to accept. So they are looking. There's also different voices in China. They try to compare. On the one hand, you do benefit, but on the other hand, you do actually, I wouldn't say sacrifice. You compromise that you're putting yourself all of your main table. You are there, but you are not able to vote. But I think, for my own understanding, I think it's better to have and then not because, for instance, China has been participating in a lot of discussion right now in Arctic. Although the newest Illusia Declaration mentioned a law of the Sea Convention is the major legal regime for Arctic Council, but I think there's still a lot of like areas that we need a very clear legal regimes in this region. I think China, together with other countries sitting there, they want to learn more about what is discussing, and then they want to also input their observation as well. So I wouldn't provide a very clear answer on that. It's always a back benefit and disadvantages as well.
Thank you. So related to that, there's some questions about whether it's overly bold or aggressive of China to write a white paper in Arctic policy, considering that they only have observer status at the premier governance regime. And I think that there's a lot of undercurrent here of the Arctic Council is perceived as the premier governance platform for the Arctic.
Yes, I think all these non-Arctic states, they are aware they're, they are second tier group in terms of their role in the Arctic governance. But in terms of the white paper, I think if you look at, for instance, like Japan and South Korea, they are very quick, even though even before they're granted observers, a lot of study has been taken in these countries. They know they have interest there, and they know very well their strategy. In terms of China, I think the white paper was released in a moment that everyone in the world, they are calling for transparency from China. They want to know clearly what is your intention in the Arctic. So at this moment, the release of the white paper, on the one hand, it's like a careful consideration from a policymaker, and it's also another like a response to the call from its domestic economy and also international policymaker who has been calling China to provide a clear and transparent, policy for people or for these other states to understand. For instance, when other states they are talking about we are granting you this observer status, we really want to know what you will do in the framework of Arctic Council. Did I get the question right?
Yeah, I think so. So I've got a question here from Timo Koivu. It says that I think the big difference to many other non-Arctic state observer strategies was the heavy reliance on general international law, UN, and even the Security Council in the context of the Arctic. There's not that much about the Arctic Council in this white paper, which was a slight surprise to him, but more about all the possible global instruments that are also relevant in the Arctic. His own argument is that China is constructing its strategy in a way that's one of the crucial members of the Arctic governance rather than only an observer in the Arctic Council. And what do you think of that?
That's not how I read about this paper. My understanding, I think in each areas, for instance, shipping and resource development and research, and also in climate change issue, I think in each sessions, China tried to elaborate its understanding and policy in the framework of Law of the Sea Convention. I think it can emphasize quite a lot that United Nations Convention Law of the Sea is the general in terms of governance. You're also talking about international law quite a little bit. So I'm not quite sure this gentleman who asked question whether we are reading this paper, maybe our focus is different, but in addition to talking about law, and we see a lot of like wording on governance, but China is not seeking its own way of, dominating or even trying to be too much engaged in ocean governance. I think it wants to emphasize on the one hand that it actually will be all of its action or policy in this region will be coherent with the Law of the Convention and Council of International Law. But on the other hand, it also emphasizes economic interests as well.
Okay, I have a question here in the room. Can you press the button on your microphone and say what your name is and where you're from?
Sure. Andrew Holland, American Security Project. Thanks for this interesting presentation. I guess I wanted to drill down a little bit more into some of the questions of why on this. I'm particularly interested in why you think the Chinese government is prioritizing bilateral relations with Arctic nations, with the Nordic nations, with Iceland, even Greenland. What is the aim here? What is the stated aim? And then what do you think is the perhaps underlying aim behind this?
Thank you. That's a very good question. As you mentioned, I think there are two approaches to be engaged in the governance in the Arctic. On the one hand, through participating in multilateral regimes like Arctic Council and many of subcategory. But on the other hand, promoting bilateral relationship. On the one hand, it give, for instance, like between China and Iceland, China and Norway, they are talking a lot about like joint research proposals, and that's one hand. So China's approach, working with northern European countries, slightly different on its approach, working with comparatively bigger party power like Canada and US. I think there's concern there because Canada, for instance, let's take Canada and Russia as one example. Their attitude towards China's engagement in Arctic is quite different, from time to time, depending on also their overall bilateral relationship with China. So that is why it's easy for China to push forward like either research cooperation or economic cooperation with like Iceland, Norway, and Denmark than with Canada and Russia and the United States. So, but I do believe that, well, the bilateral cooperation in the Arctic, it's more sends a signal that we see more opportunity in terms, let's take US, China and Russia as one example. We see more opportunities at this moment. But in terms of between China and the US, because currently the two countries have a lot of other priority issues on the agenda, like the trade war and their issues in the South China Sea, and also how they view each other as a bilateral relations. So I don't see a lot of discussion on the China-United States cooperation in Arctic yet.
Can I follow up?
Yeah.
So you think, particularly with the smaller Arctic nations, this is a commercial priority. This is about securing commercial relations for Chinese state-owned industries to invest and trade with these nations. This is commercial.
I would follow your observation. I think, at least from my understanding, I think if you look at like the resource development case by case, and also their bilateral, a lot of research proposal, I think more on commercial interest. And in this white paper, China talking about like the polar maritime Silk Road. So right now, there are discussion between China and Russia on like building facilities in some of the Russian ports. But so in the future, probably we'll see more discussion between China and Iceland or China, Norway, on how to increase or working together to improve the maritime infrastructure in those littoral states. So I see more on economic, commercial angle rather than strategy angle. But
Thanks. I have a question here from Linda Shaw. It says, since China has a mixed environmentally sensitive record, basically in terms of development, referring to things like fisheries off Argentina, mining in Guyana, other examples worldwide, how will China's role in the Arctic governance paradigm establish and enforce environmentally responsible development by China?
I think the example you gave this question is giving about the bedrock environmental issue. I think environment issue is a big concern in China, and we have a lot of very bad examples like pollution back in the country, and I'm not quite sure about those examples again, but given the background, I think it's in a learning process, so it's always in China's concern how to improve the environmental standard, how to make sure the environmental consideration is well taken in the Arctic. That is why I think in this white paper, and it talk a lot about how to increase environmental standards, how to make sure the climate change, etc., will be incorporated in this paper. There's a lot to learn. So on the one hand, you probably has bad record, but you had to a lot of times to learn. At least, and if you actually listed this environment as a quite important criteria in this white paper, which I see as a more positive signal there.
Makes sense. So I have a question from Heidi McCann. It says, will China engage or has China started to engage with Arctic indigenous organizations such as the Inuit Circumpolar Council and the ITK, which I believe is a group in Canada?
Can you repeat the question again?
Will China engage with the Arctic indigenous groups?
I think it did mention that in a white paper that in the future, with the aim like protecting or engaging more this indigenous group, I think it will in the future. I think right now one of the countries that has done a lot of is South Korea. I was once had opportunity to talk to the South Korea group, Arctic group, and they have been working very closely with this indigenous group. So I'm thinking in the future it could happen. But I'm not quite sure at this moment. I don't have any evidence to prove that yet.
Other questions in the room? Yeah.
Hi, thank you for this presentation. My name is Rebecca Lunge. I'm from the Greenland representation here in DC. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on something you mentioned regarding the Denmark support or confusion, the issues domestically between Greenland and Denmark. If I could just briefly mention, we have the 2009 Self-Government Act. In that act, the relationship between Denmark and Greenland is determined, and it determines that Greenland represents itself within areas that are home taken by the Greenlandic government. So areas as mineral resources is taken care of by the Greenlandic government. But I would be interested to know from Chinese side, what are their perspectives on the relationship, or what are the confusions and the challenges they meet? Thank you.
Thank you. You know well much than me about this question because you know what's happening there. I think my observation on China's engagement in Denmark is, well, I think if we have like a real project between China and Denmark, both countries will benefit. But because most, as you mentioned, most of the WZ, it's in Greenland. So when China is talking like about oil corporations, talking about Greenland government, Greenland wants to be independent, as we see it. And then I think China is a dilemma because China is a country you know very well much about territorial integrity is very important. So it doesn't want to be engaged or involved in any of the domestic issues like between Denmark and Greenland. So it has to be very careful before or during its discussion with the Denmark government. It doesn't want to be pictured as a country supporting Greenland to be a separate part of the country. I think that's what I mentioned, that there was a concern from China's angle, and there was concern probably from Denmark as well.
So I think we have time for one more question. I have one here from John Orbeck. Says, and this is probably appropriate as we are the Arctic Research Consortium of the U.S. Considering the primary interest of China in commercial development, does that mean that Chinese Arctic research will be carried out in a unilateral type national program or more of a cooperative international cooperation?
That's a very good question to end of discussion. I think in a white paper it mentioned that in order for a lot of like infrastructure, for instance, feasibility, infrastructure construction, and also other like oil and gas, etc., like many of proposal or development, it has to be governed by the domestic law of the individual countries. If that happen to be that country's national jurisdiction, I think that's very well clarified in the white paper.
All right, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So thank you very much for an excellent presentation, Dr. Nong. And she will be around after the seminar to answer any further questions one-on-one. We wanted to make a few announcements at the conclusion here. First of all, the next seminar is going to be taking place on the 11th of May, featuring Elizabeth Arnold, who many of you may know from her previous work with the National Public Radio. Also, we have a Anchorage Arctic Research Day coming up on April 26th in Anchorage. If you happen to be in Anchorage at that point, I encourage you to register. It'll be the biggest Arctic research gathering in the city all year. We are also hosting in May some Arctic indigenous scholars. You can check out our website for details on that, and they'll be giving presentations as well as part of the seminar series. And we'll be celebrating the 30th anniversary of ARCIS and Arctic Research Community at the Polar 2018 conference in Davos in June. The seminar will be posted online as well as the slides and the recording, so you can check that out about a week from now. And otherwise, encourage you to stick around, refreshments outside, and please fill out the evaluations, whether you're online or in the room. We really value your feedback, and thank you so much for coming, and have a great rest of your day.